the hushed corridors of the world's richest boardrooms, power doesn't always speak in numbers. It whispers in handshakes, eye contact, and the subtle rituals of respect. But what happens when prejudice poisons those rituals? When arrogance blinds someone so completely they fail to see the storm they've just unleashed? It began with a single gesture, or rather, the refusal of one. A billionaire woman, her name etched in the glossy covers of financial magazines, walked into a negotiation that could shift the balance of industries. Cameras flashed, assistants hurried. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone in that room knew this was history in motion. Everyone except her, because in that defining moment she saw only skin color. A black woman extended her hand, calm, poised, steady, and was met not with respect, but with contempt. A cold refusal, delivered with a smirk so sharp it cut deeper than words ever could. The silence that followed was deafening. Executives shifted uncomfortably. Journalists scribbled nervously. And yet she, the billionaire, believed she had won a small victory. To her, it was a dismissal, a reminder of her place in the hierarchy she thought she owned. But what she didn't know was this: the woman she humiliated was not just a guest in that room. She was the architect of the very deal on which billions rested. Her signature, her influence, her vision held the keys to a future the billionaire could neither buy nor bully. In the span of a breath, arrogance had sown the seeds of downfall. A gesture so small, so seemingly insignificant, was about to ignite a firestorm of consequences. This is not just a story about money. It is not merely about business or wealth. It is about the ugliness of racism lurking in the highest towers of privilege, and how, in one chilling instant, a careless act of prejudice threatened to unravel a $5 billion empire. History remembers wars, revolutions, and treaties. But sometimes history is rewritten by a handshake that never happened. And in that absence lies a lesson the world cannot afford to ignore. The billionaire woman's story begins not in that boardroom, but in the glittering rise of her empire. Born into privilege, she inherited not only wealth, but a ruthless instinct sharpened in the halls of elite education and exclusive social circles. To the outside world, she was a symbol of power. Her name echoed across financial channels, her face featured on magazine covers, celebrating self-made women. Though the truth was far more complicated. Her wealth gave her insulation. Her skin, her status, her connections, all shields against accountability. Over the years, she learned not only to amass wealth, but to cultivate fear. Those who worked with her often described her presence as magnetic and chilling all at once. A woman who could smile at investors while dismantling competitors without a shred of hesitation. But beneath that glittering empire lay shadows. Whispers of lawsuits settled quietly, rumors of discriminatory practices, patterns of exclusion and elitism that marked her business dealings. To her, racism was not hatred, it was hierarchy. She did not burn crosses or shout slurs. She simply believed with unshakable arrogance that some were born to lead and others to serve. That belief would follow her into the boardroom where the $5 billion deal was to be signed. The deal itself was monumental, a merger poised to reshape an entire industry with global ramifications. Billions of dollars, tens of thousands of jobs, and the future of innovation were all balanced on the fine edge of signatures. For her, it was another conquest, another jewel to place in her crown of victories. What she did not know, what no one had yet revealed, was that the woman she would casually humiliate that day was not a background player. She was not merely another attendee in the crowd of suits. The black woman had fought her way here from an entirely different world. Her story was one of grit, survival, and brilliance, sharpened not in privilege, but in fire. Raised in communities, scarred by neglect and systemic racism, she had learned early the weight of invisibility. The way society looked past her, dismissed her, underestimated her, and yet invisibility became her weapon. While others ignored her, she studied, built, and strategized. Each barrier she faced became a blueprint for overcoming the next. Through education, persistence, and vision, she carved out a place not just in the room, but at the very heart of global finance. By the time the billionaire crossed paths with her, she had already built partnerships across continents, crafted networks that stretched from Wall Street to emerging economies, and earned respect from those who knew the difference between inherited power and earned influence. But her ascent had not come without scars. She carried with her the weight of battles fought silently, the exhaustion of being the only one in the room who looked like her, and the constant pressure to prove, again and again, that she belonged. The setup to their collision was not just financial. It was historical. It was the echo of centuries of injustice compressed into a single handshake. One woman who believed power was her birthright, and another who had clawed her way to prove power could be claimed. And as the stage was set for that fateful meeting, forces were already moving. Journalists whispered about the deal's secrecy. Rival companies sharpened their knives, waiting for the merger to falter. Investors placed bets on whether this fragile alliance would hold. What no one foresaw was that the spark of its unraveling would come not from legal battles, not from financial miscalculations, but from a gesture so small it could be missed in the blink of an eye. The refusal of a handshake. A billionaire's smirk, and the ripple effect of prejudice echoing across billions of dollars. The stage was set. The players had taken their positions. The clock was ticking on a downfall that would reveal far more than a failed deal. It would expose the rot at the core of privilege itself. The air in the boardroom did not return to normal after the refused handshake. It thickened, as though the oxygen itself had been rearranged by prejudice. Every person present had witnessed the moment, and yet no one dared to address it. Silence filled the space, but silence is never empty. It carried weight, tension, unease. Some lowered their eyes to their papers, pretending to shuffle documents. Others glanced nervously between the two women, as though caught between loyalty and fear. Cameras, placed discreetly in corners to capture the historic signing, lingered for a heartbeat too long. They caught the billionaire's dismissive smirk, the casual flick of her wrist, and the black woman's steady composure. The billionaire believed the moment had passed. In her mind, it was nothing more than a small assertion of dominance, a reminder of who dictated the terms of respect in her world. She straightened her jacket, lifted her chin, and leaned back into the leather chair, her expression calm, almost smug. But what she failed to recognize was that humiliation leaves a trace. It lingers in the air like smoke, seeping into the walls, into the posture of those who saw it. And in this room, where billions of dollars were poised to exchange hands, perception mattered more than numbers. The black woman remained still. Not a flicker of emotion escaped her face. To the untrained eye, she seemed unmoved. But beneath, her composure lay years of discipline, a survival instinct honed by countless encounters where dignity had to be protected at all costs. She understood that one outburst, one slip of visible anger could undo everything. Power, after all, was not only in possession, it was in restraint. Around the table, presentations began. Graphs lit up screens. Analysts spoke of projections, markets, and synergies. Voices echoed against the polished glass walls, but none of it masked the undercurrent running beneath the conversation. Everyone was aware of the elephant in the room, a gesture that had fractured the atmosphere. The billionaire's voice cut through the air like a blade. She spoke with confidence, layering her words with charm she had perfected for decades. She highlighted her empire's strengths, her vision for the future, her certainty that this merger would secure her dominance for generations. Her words flowed like silk, but they carried a hidden arrogance, an assumption that those present existed to validate her. The black woman listened, every word etching itself into her memory. She had heard variations of this tone before, in classrooms where professors underestimated her, in offices where colleagues questioned her authority, in negotiations where men looked past her to address someone else. The cadence of dismissal was all too familiar, but she had not come here to be dismissed. Quietly, without raising her voice, She began to shift the energy in the room. She placed a single document on the table, a proposal her team had crafted, with precision. It was not just numbers, it was a blueprint for innovation, sustainability, and global reach. The kind of vision that went beyond profits, tapping into the future of entire industries. Eyes drifted toward her. Executives leaned in. A subtle current of respect began to move across the table. Unspoken, but undeniable. The billionaire noticed. Her smile faltered for the briefest second. It was a crack in the armor, a flash of recognition that perhaps she had miscalculated. But arrogance is a stubborn companion. Rather than recalibrate, she doubled down, pressing harder, raising her voice, speaking over others. The room, however, was shifting. Where once her words commanded the center, now they collided with the weight of the black woman's quiet authority. Every sentence the billionaire spoke seemed to echo her own insecurity. Every point she made was overshadowed by the presence of someone she had underestimated. And then, the first ripple appeared. A major investor, one whose allegiance she had always assumed was unshakable, turned slightly toward the black woman as she presented her vision. It was a small gesture, imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. But the billionaire saw it, and it unsettled her. Because in the world of power, attention is currency. And for the first time in years, she realized that attention was slipping away. The refusal of a handshake had not ended in humiliation. It had lit the fuse of something far more dangerous, a silent reckoning, unfolding in real time, in a room where fortunes could be built or destroyed in a single breath. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible to those who weren't trained to see it. But in a room where billions rested on perception, even the smallest movement carried weight. As the black woman spoke, calmly, methodically, with precision sharpened over a lifetime of being underestimated, the atmosphere began to tilt. Her words were not grandiose, not drenched in ego, but measured, deliberate, anchored in evidence and vision. She spoke of sustainable strategies, long-term growth, and untapped markets that stretched beyond the short-sighted hunger for profit. Each sentence was like a stone laid carefully into place, building a foundation impossible to ignore. Executives leaned closer, pens stilled above notepads. Assistants typed more slowly, as though unwilling to break the rhythm of her voice with the clatter of keys. Even the investors, hardened veterans of countless deals, found themselves shifting in their chairs, their eyes drawn to her. The billionaire noticed. What had once been her stage was slowly being overtaken. What had once been her spotlight was bleeding into someone else's orbit. And though she masked her discomfort with a practiced smile, her fingers betrayed her. Tapping lightly against the polished wood of the table, a rhythm too quick to be casual, she tried to reassert control. Interruptions, counterpoints, a subtle dismissal here, a sharp remark there. She wielded the tactics of someone accustomed to having the final word. But each attempt only revealed more of her insecurity. The black woman did not flinch. She did not raise her voice, did not bite at the bait of confrontation. She let the interruptions pass, like waves breaking against stone. And with every calm response, every measured return to her vision, she stripped power from the billionaire without ever lifting a weapon. That restraint was devastating. Because arrogance feeds on reaction. It thrives when its target bristles, when anger validates its dominance. But when arrogance meets composure, unyielding, unbothered, and undeniably competent, it begins to collapse under its own weight. And collapse it did. Investors began asking her questions, not the billionaire, her. They leaned into her analysis, not the billionaire's projections, but her strategies. They wanted her numbers, her foresight, her vision. And in those questions, the room declared its allegiance without saying a word. The billionaire's voice grew sharper, almost frantic. She raised her tone, spoke faster, tried to force urgency into her pitch. But urgency is a poor disguise for fear. The very energy she projected betrayed her, revealing not dominance, but desperation. The black woman, meanwhile, grew only steadier. Her calm deepened with each moment, and in that calm lay authority. Not the brittle authority of inherited privilege, but the unshakable kind forged in years of being forced to prove her worth 10 times over. The fracture widened. Journalists in the room began scribbling notes, no longer focused solely on the historic merger, but on the dynamic playing out before their eyes. They saw the cracks in the billionaire's image, the faltering mask of a woman who had always assumed control was her birthright. And somewhere, deep in the billionaire's mind, a truth began to take root. She would never admit it, not even to herself, but it gnawed at the edges of her certainty. She was no longer the most powerful person in the room, not because of money, not because of status, but because power had shifted into the hands of someone she had dismissed with a smirk. The refusal of a handshake was no longer a moment. It had become a mirror, reflecting her arrogance back at her, magnified, undeniable. And though she still sat at the head of the table, she could feel it slipping away, inch by inch, into the steady hands of the woman she had underestimated. The deal had not yet collapsed. The signatures had not yet been signed. But already, something irreversible had begun. And when perception begins to unravel, empires follow. By the time the second hour of discussion unfolded, the billionaire could feel the room slipping away from her like sand through clenched fists. Every instinct told her to fight harder, to tighten her grip, to remind everyone present of her status. She spoke louder, interrupted more aggressively, layered her words with a kind of urgency meant to re-establish dominance. But dominance built on fear only lasts as long as people agree to be afraid. And in that boardroom, fear was dissolving. The black woman had shifted the atmosphere entirely. Her presence was no longer quiet resistance, it was command. Executives deferred to her insights. Investors redirected questions to her analysis. Even rivals, those who had come ready to scrutinize every weakness, found themselves nodding at her logic, conceding her authority without even realizing it. The billionaire, however, refused to yield. Arrogance does not retreat gracefully. It claws, it resists, it scrambles to hold the illusion together, even as it fractures. She launched into projections, promising aggressive growth, claiming markets would bend to her will, dismissing the risks others highlighted. Her words were forceful, but force without substance is transparent. The harder she pushed, the clearer it became. Her vision was not strategy, it was entitlement. And in contrast, the black woman's vision gleamed brighter, not because she sought to outshine, but because truth needs no embellishment. She spoke of challenges and how they could be met, of opportunities long ignored, of futures built not on exploitation but on sustainability and inclusion. It wasn't just business, it was conviction. And conviction cannot be faked. The cracks widened. Journalists who had been tasked with reporting a triumphant merger now whispered among themselves, their notes shifting from numbers to dynamics. Assistants who once mirrored the billionaire's energy now leaned slightly toward the black woman, their eyes drawn to her steadiness. Investors exchanged subtle glances, unspoken acknowledgements passing between them. And still, the billionaire fought. She laughed too sharply at minor comments, as though mocking others would reinforce her control. She leaned forward across the table, invading space, trying to shrink the presence of her rival with sheer physicality. But each attempt revealed more of her desperation. And then came the moment she did not anticipate. An investor, one whose wealth and influence anchored the deal, asked a direct question. Not to her, to the black woman. It was a question of direction, of trust, of who held the real vision for the future of this alliance. The silence that followed was not cruel, not mocking. It was decisive. The billionaire sat frozen, her practiced smile stiffening into something brittle. For the first time in years, she was not the gravitational center of the room, and in that silence everyone felt it. The refusal of a handshake had become something larger, something irreversible. It was no longer about a slight. It was about revelation. about a mirror held up to power, exposing the emptiness behind arrogance and the strength behind resilience. The billionaire's empire was not yet crumbling. The signatures had not yet been abandoned, but the ground beneath her was cracking, and she could hear the faint tremor of collapse approaching. And still, she could not see it clearly. Because arrogance blinds its host, it convinces them that cracks are illusions, that fractures are temporary, that the center will always hold because it always has. But history is full of empires that believed the same, and in this boardroom, history was preparing to repeat itself. The stage for the climax was set. The billionaire still sat at the head of the table, but her throne had turned into a spotlight, exposing not her power, but her fragility. The deal, once framed as her crowning achievement, now hovered precariously on the edge of collapse. The room no longer revolved around her. It orbited the black woman, whose quiet authority had become unshakable. And then, the moment arrived. The lead investor, the one whose voice carried more weight than any press, Release, placed his pen gently on the table. The sound was soft, but it cut through the boardroom like a gavel. His eyes, calm but firm, turned toward the black woman. He asked the question that would decide everything. Who do you believe should lead this alliance? The room froze. The billionaire's practiced smile wavered, her chest tightening as the unthinkable unfolded. The question had not been directed to her, though she had built her empire believing such questions could only ever belong to her. All eyes turned to the black woman, and in that moment, the billionaire realized the depth of her miscalculation. The very person she had dismissed with a smirk, the one she had refused to acknowledge with the simplest gesture of respect, now held the weight of $5 billion in her hands. The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation. The black woman did not rush. She breathed, steady and unflinching, before placing her hand on the documents she had prepared. Her voice, calm and deliberate, filled the room. She spoke of unity, of vision, of progress rooted in equality rather than hierarchy. She spoke not as someone demanding power, but as someone embodying it. And with each word, the billionaire's empire fractured. Investors nodded. Executives leaned forward. Journalists scribbled furiously, realizing they were witnessing not just a deal, but a downfall. The billionaire tried to intervene, her voice rising in protest, insisting that the alliance was hers to lead. But desperation has a sound, and everyone heard it. Her words, once sharp enough to silence rivals, now rang hollow, echoes of authority long since abandoned. The black woman, without raising her tone, had dismantled her. And then came the final blow. The investors announced their decision. The deal would move forward, but not under the billionaire's terms. The leadership, the vision, the future would be entrusted to the black woman. The boardroom erupted in movement. Pens scratched across paper, assistants rushed to finalize documents, journalists whispered about headlines that would ripple across the globe. The billionaire sat motionless, her world collapsing in real time. The refusal of a handshake, a moment she had dismissed as trivial, had become the catalyst for her undoing. In her arrogance, she had revealed herself not as powerful, but as fragile, unworthy of the empire she sought to control. The black woman, the one she had tried to humiliate, now stood as the architect of a new future. And in that reversal lay a lesson so sharp, so undeniable, it could never be forgotten. Because in the end, power is not in the hand you refuse to shake. It is in the hand strong enough to remain steady and patient enough to let arrogance destroy itself. The papers were signed. The decision had been made. And though the cameras in the room were not broadcasting live, the story of what had just unfolded would spread like wildfire. The billionaire remained seated long after the meeting concluded. The room, once her stage, now felt like a cage closing in on her. Her empire had not crumbled in numbers that day, not yet, but in perception. And in the world she inhabited, perception was power. Without it, wealth was fragile, influence was fleeting, and legacies dissolved into whispers. The journalists knew it. Their pens captured more than figures and contracts. They captured the spectacle of arrogance undone. By the time their reports reached the public, the world would not remember the projected profits or the market expansions. They would remember the refusal of a handshake, the smirk, the downfall that followed. The black woman, on the other hand, did not gloat. She did not celebrate loudly or bask in the billionaire's defeat. She understood too well the cost of the moment. Victories like this were never without weight. They carried the memory of every door that had been slammed in her face, every whisper that she did not belong, every battle she had fought in silence. Her triumph was not just her own. It belonged to those who had been dismissed, overlooked, humiliated, and told they could never sit at the table. Her presence at the helm of a $5 billion deal was not merely a shift in leadership. It was a fracture in the narrative that power belonged only to a chosen few. And yet beneath the surface, the story was larger still, because the billionaire's refusal had revealed something deeper: the fragility of empires built on arrogance. One gesture had exposed what decades of privilege had concealed: that power without respect is hollow, and that respect cannot be bought with wealth or inherited through status. It must be earned. As the news broke, reactions rippled across industries. Some celebrated the shift, calling it overdue, a long-awaited recognition of talent long ignored. Others recoiled, clinging to old hierarchies, fearing what it meant for the established order. But no one remained indifferent. The moment forced a reckoning. And in boardrooms around the world, executives whispered a warning to themselves: pay attention to who you dismiss. Pay attention to who you underestimate. Because in an age where every gesture is magnified, every action preserved in digital memory, arrogance no longer hides behind polished smiles. It reveals itself. And when it does, the world remembers. The billionaire's downfall was not a financial loss alone. It was reputational. Her name, once synonymous with dominance, became shorthand for blindness. A cautionary tale replayed in classrooms, documentaries, and think pieces. The empire she fought to expand had survived the numbers, but not the narrative. And in history, it is the narrative that endures. The black woman, meanwhile, became a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. Her story was not one of overnight triumph, but of years of resilience finally seen, finally acknowledged. She carried with her the proof that silence could be strategic, that composure could be weaponized, that dignity could outlast arrogance. And perhaps most importantly, she reminded the world of a truth often forgotten in the glare of wealth. That power is not the loudest voice in the room. It is the voice that remains steady when arrogance falters. In the end, it was not billions of dollars that rewrote the story. It was not contracts or mergers or market expansions. It was a single gesture, a hand extended, and a refusal born of prejudice. That refusal became the spark that revealed the truth, that arrogance destroys itself, and that respect is the currency empires cannot survive without. So the question remains: in a world still riddled with injustice, still shaped by prejudice, how many more empires must fall before we finally learn that the worth of a person can never be measured by the color of their skin,